The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of U-boat command headquarters in Courneval, France, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air, while Capitaine Sauce Eberhard Gott examined the latest intelligence photographs with an expression that moved rapidly from curiosity to outright derision. The date was May 17, 1943, and the images spread across his desk depicted something the Americans had the audacity to classify as an aircraft carrier. Gott's monocle glinted as he leaned closer to scrutinize the vessel identified as USS Bogue, a ship that had already been operating for 8 months but only now attracted serious German attention. The more he studied the photographs, the more absurd the entire concept became, until finally he couldn't contain himself and released a sharp bark of laughter that echoed through the operations room. Contra-Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg glanced up from his own paperwork at the sound, his eyebrows raised in question. Gott slid the photographs across the polished wooden desk without a word, watching as his superior officer picked them up and began his own examination. The disdain that gradually settled across Friedeberg's features mirrored Gott's own reaction perfectly. Here was a vessel so obviously cobbled together from merchant ship components, so clearly the product of desperate improvisation rather than proper naval architecture, that it seemed almost insulting to categorize it alongside the magnificent fleet carriers that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. The Americans had essentially welded a flight deck onto a cargo ship hull and declared victory, or so it appeared to both German officers as they passed the photographs back and forth between them. That evening, Gott sat down to update the war diary with his assessment of this latest American development. His pen moved steadily across the page as he recorded his professional opinion that the enemy had resorted to constructing carriers from merchant vessels, creating what he characterized as floating crates equipped with a handful of aircraft that posed no credible threat to German Wolfpack operations. He noted their obvious deficiencies with barely concealed satisfaction, cataloguing how these converted merchantmen lacked the speed that made fleet carriers such formidable weapons, possessed none of the armor plating that protected proper warships from battle damage, and displayed none of the elegant lines that characterized vessels designed from the keel up for naval warfare. In Gott's estimation, these escort carriers represented nothing more than desperation given physical form in steel and rivets. What neither Gott nor Friedeberg could possibly comprehend in that moment was that the photographs they dismissed so contemptuously actually depicted the instrument that would orchestrate their complete destruction. The timeline of their defeat had already been set in motion, though they remained blissfully ignorant of this fact. Within 18 months, these diminutive escort carriers they found so laughable would fundamentally transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a theatre where Germany held significant advantages into an Allied victory so comprehensive and devastating that U-boat crews would begin referring to their combat patrols as nothing more than elaborately choreographed suicide missions. The reversal would be so complete, so total, that it would shake German naval confidence to its very foundations. The transformation was already being written in the massive American shipyards, where a man named Henry Kaiser had revolutionized manufacturing processes to produce escort carriers at a rate that exceeded Germany's ability to construct submarines. The psychological journey that German naval officers would undertake, traveling from their current position of contempt through growing concern and into outright terror, would unfold not over the span of years, but across mere months as these professional military men discovered to their horror that American production logic had once again exceeded the boundaries of what their imaginations had thought possible. The genuine beginning of this story reaches back to June 8, 1941, a date that fell 18 months before Pearl Harbor would drag America fully into the war. On that day, President Roosevelt recognized something that many of his own admirals initially dismissed as strategically impossible. The United States needed aircraft carriers, and not just a few dozen, but hundreds of them, scattered across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, to provide the kind of comprehensive coverage that modern naval warfare demanded. The problem that immediately presented itself was both obvious and seemingly insurmountable. Fleet carriers of the traditional design required approximately 3 years from the laying of the keel to final commissioning, and each one consumed resources equivalent to constructing 10 destroyers. The mathematics simply didn't work if America wanted to field carrier forces quickly enough to matter in the current conflict. Roosevelt's solution struck traditional naval thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic as somewhere between absurd and borderline insane. Rather than attempting to accelerate the construction of proper fleet carriers, America would instead convert merchant ships into carriers, building them on commercial shipyard production lines using techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. The concept immediately generated fierce criticism from those who understood naval architecture. These converted carriers would necessarily be slow, making them vulnerable to faster enemy warships. They would lack proper armor protection, meaning a single well-placed torpedo could send them to the bottom. Their limited size would restrict the number of aircraft they could operate. The list of objections seemed endless, yet Roosevelt's counter-argument possessed an elegant simplicity that would prove devastatingly effective. Produce these carriers in such overwhelming quantities that their individual weaknesses became strategically irrelevant through sheer numbers. Captain Friedrich Rouge, serving in the critical role of naval liaison to the German High Command, received copies of the initial American escort carrier specifications sometime in early 1942. His review of these documents was conducted with the professional incredulity of a trained naval officer examining plans that violated every principle of proper warship design. The specifications revealed maximum speeds of merely 18 knots, barely faster than a surfaced submarine could manage with its diesel engines running at full power. Some models would feature wooden flight decks rather than armoured steel. The hull construction relied on commercial-grade steel instead of the hardened armour plating that protected warships from battle damage. Single propeller screws made them exceptionally vulnerable to torpedo strikes that could leave them dead in the water. Rouge compiled his findings into a detailed analysis for Admiral Raeder, concluding with professional certainty that the Americans appeared to be fundamentally confusing quantity with quality, constructing what he characterized as maritime disasters waiting to happen that any properly trained U-boat commander would feast upon like a wolf among sheep. The confidence that permeated the German naval establishment rested on foundations that seemed unshakable when examined through the lens of their recent successes. The U-boat force had achieved truly remarkable results between September 1939 and December 1942, sending 1,299 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Those vessels represented more than 6 million tons of shipping, cargo vessels and tankers that had been carrying vital supplies to Britain. The Wolfpack tactics that Admiral Karl Dönitz had developed and refined had effectively turned the North Atlantic into what Winston Churchill himself identified as the only aspect of the war that truly frightened him during the darkest days. German submarines operated with what seemed like near impunity across vast stretches of ocean, surfacing under cover of darkness to pursue convoys with diesel engines that provided 17 knots of surface speed, making them faster than the merchant ships they hunted. Aircraft posed the most significant threat to submarine operations, but the mathematics of range had created what submariners called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly expanse of ocean beyond the operational radius of land-based patrol planes. In this gap, which stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, U-boats could congregate to slaughter merchant convoys without fear of aerial attack. It was in this supposedly safe zone that the escort carriers would prove most revolutionary, though German naval planners couldn't yet grasp this reality. Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner, commanding U-230, made his first encounter with an American escort carrier on March 3, 1943, while operating near convoy SC-121. His war diary entry for that date captured the mixture of curiosity and dismissal that characterized German reactions to these vessels. Werner recorded sighting what initially appeared to be a standard merchant vessel, but one that had been modified with aircraft visible on its deck. He maintained surveillance for approximately 2 hours, during which time he observed the carrier conducting flight operations that struck him as amateurish at best, with visible difficulties managing aircraft in the prevailing wind conditions. Werner's report to BDU, the U-boat command headquarters, dripped with contempt as he characterized this development as evidence that American desperation had reached the point where they were sending merchant ships equipped with a few airplanes into combat zones. Werner's contemptuous assessment reflected the standard German naval doctrine that had been developed over decades of professional military education and refinement. What this doctrine failed to account for were three critical factors that would ultimately doom the U-boat force. First, these escort carriers didn't need to be fast because they travelled as part of convoys that moved at a sedate 8 to 10 knots, meaning the carriers could easily keep pace while maintaining continuous air coverage. Second, they didn't need to operate large air groups because their aircraft only needed to accomplish one specific mission, forcing U-boats to submerge. Once underwater, submarines saw their speed reduced from 17 knots on the surface to a mere 7 knots submerged, making it impossible for them to maneuver into attack positions against moving convoys. Third, and ultimately most devastating to German operations, the Americans would build so many of these carriers that eventually the entire Atlantic Ocean would fall within the umbrella of aircraft coverage, eliminating the mid-Atlantic gap entirely. The production statistics that would ultimately seal the fate of the U-boat force were already accumulating throughout the spring of 1943, though German intelligence agencies grossly underestimated both the numbers and the rate of construction. Henry Kaiser's shipyard facilities in Vancouver, Washington, had systematically reduced the construction timeline for a Casablanca-class escort carrier from 6 months down to an almost unbelievable 10 weeks. By standardizing components and applying assembly line techniques learned from automobile manufacturing, techniques that had never previously been applied to shipbuilding on this scale, Kaiser's workforce could launch a new escort carrier approximately every week by the summer of 1943. German intelligence analysts, working with incomplete information and preconceived notions about shipbuilding timelines, estimated American escort carrier production at perhaps 1 vessel per month, a figure that already seemed alarmingly high. The reality was closer to 1 completed carrier every 5 days during peak production periods, a rate that would have seemed impossible to any pre-war naval planner. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kremer, in command of U-333, experienced his first genuine glimpse of what mass-produced naval aviation would mean for submarine operations on April 23, 1943. His boat was running on the surface approximately 650 miles southwest of Ireland, positioned well within the mid-Atlantic gap that had previously represented safe operating territory for surfaced submarines. The sudden cry from the lookout sent his crew scrambling toward their crash dive stations, but not before Kremer himself had time to scan the horizon. No land-based aircraft could possibly reach this position, which meant the planes he was seeing had to have originated from a fleet carrier. Yet intelligence reports indicated no fleet carriers operating in this area. His war diary captured the confusion and dawning realization that something fundamental had changed in Atlantic operations. Kremer recorded sighting 2 Avenger torpedo bombers approaching from the northeast, aircraft appearing at what should have been an impossible range from any land base. He assumed they must have launched from a fleet carrier despite the absence of intelligence reports placing such a vessel in the area, and immediately ordered a crash dive to evade the attack. Depth charges detonated close enough to his hull to cause minor damage, the concussive force reminding him that his boat was now vulnerable in ways it hadn't been just months before. After remaining submerged for 2 hours to ensure the aircraft had departed, Kremer surfaced to recharge batteries and assess damage. What he saw changed his understanding of the naval war. The convoy his boat had been stalking now travelled with an escort that appeared to be a converted merchant vessel actively launching aircraft from a flight deck. His war diary entry posed the question that would haunt German submariners for the remainder of the conflict. Exactly how many of these ships did the Americans possess? The answer to Kremer's desperate question would have immediately shattered German naval morale if the full scope had been understood. By May 1943, the United States Navy had already commissioned 11 escort carriers, with an additional 40 vessels under various stages of construction in shipyards scattered across the American coastline. Each carrier operated between 24 and 30 aircraft, depending on the specific model and operational requirements. The pilots flying these aircraft were mostly reservists, men who had been working as civilians merely 2 years earlier before receiving their draft notices or volunteering for service. Their training had been conducted in abbreviated programs that absolutely horrified traditional naval aviators who had spent years mastering their craft. Yet these amateur pilots, flying from what were essentially merchant ships with flight decks welded on top, were about to accomplish something that the Kriegsmarine had declared strategically impossible just months earlier. They would achieve the complete suppression of the U-boat threat through systematic coverage and relentless pressure. Rear Admiral Julius Führer, charged with reviewing German naval intelligence reports during June 1943, began noting the increasingly frequent reports of U-boat encounters with carrier aircraft in areas that had previously been considered beyond aircraft range. His analysis, which was discovered among captured documents after the war concluded, revealed his growing concern about this development. Führer acknowledged that American escort carriers were now being reported across multiple operational theaters, including the North Atlantic, South Atlantic, and Mediterranean approaches. Intelligence suggested at least 20 operational vessels, though Führer suspected this might actually be an underestimate. If the numbers were accurate, he concluded, this represented a fundamental alteration in convoy protection capabilities that demanded an immediate and comprehensive reassessment of Wolfpack tactics. The reassessment that Führer recommended came far too late to alter the trajectory of the campaign. USS Bogue and her escort group had already initiated what U-boat crews would later refer to as the extended Black May period, a time when submarine losses climbed to unsustainable levels while successful attacks on merchant shipping plummeted. On May 22, 1943, aircraft from Bogue spotted U-569 running on the surface, catching the submarine in a vulnerable position far from any diving cover. The submarine executed an immediate crash dive, but the Avenger that had spotted it marked the position with a smoke float, creating a beacon that allowed subsequent aircraft to maintain contact even after the submarine disappeared beneath the waves. What followed was 4 hours of coordinated attacks that demonstrated the new reality of Atlantic warfare. U-569's commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans-Peter Hinsch, fought desperately to evade the pursuing aircraft, but the combination of radar, sonar buoys, and persistent air coverage made escape impossible. Finally, with his boat taking damage and his options exhausted, Hinsch surfaced his dying submarine long enough to radio a final message back to U-boat headquarters. Under continuous air attack, he reported, carrier aircraft maintaining contact despite all evasion attempts. No escape possible. Scuttling vessel. The message represented something unprecedented in German submarine operations, the acknowledgement of complete tactical helplessness against an enemy that could maintain contact indefinitely. Admiral Dönitz himself reviewed Hinsch's final transmission, initially suspecting some form of British deception operation designed to undermine German morale. Only after 2 additional experienced boat commanders reported similar experiences of continuous air attack in the mid-Atlantic did the full reality begin penetrating the consciousness of German naval leadership. Continuous air coverage had been theoretically impossible in the mid-Atlantic gap, the fundamental assumption upon which much of their Atlantic strategy rested. Yet experienced commanders, men whose judgment and competence had been proven through multiple successful patrols, were now reporting exactly that phenomenon with increasing frequency. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Rudloff, commanding U-709, had his own encounter with aircraft from USS Kor on June 24, 1943. His subsequent report to U-boat command revealed just how completely the tactical situation had been revolutionized in a matter of weeks. Rudloff described being attacked by carrier aircraft 700 miles from the nearest land base, forcing his boat to remain submerged for 14 continuous hours while the battery charge slowly depleted. When he finally surfaced under cover of darkness to recharge the batteries, thinking himself safe until dawn, his boat was immediately detected by aircraft that appeared to possess some form of detection equipment capable of locating surfaced submarines in complete darkness. The aircraft appeared to have unlimited persistence, circling his position and forcing repeated crash dives that further exhausted his battery reserves. Rudloff's report concluded with a plea for instructions on dealing with continuous air coverage, a question for which German naval doctrine had no answer. There were no instructions available because German naval planning had never seriously contemplated the possibility of continuous air coverage extending across mid-ocean areas. The escort carriers operated in what the Americans called hunter-killer groups, typically centered on a single carrier escorted by 3 to 4 destroyers, or destroyer escorts. Each group could maintain dawn-to-dusk surveillance over a roughly 100-mile radius, creating a bubble of air coverage that moved with the carrier. When multiple escort carriers operated in proximity, either as part of the same convoy or as coordinating hunter-killer groups, they created overlapping zones of coverage that made surface operations absolutely suicidal for any submarine unfortunate enough to be caught within their reach. The technical capabilities of American escort carriers significantly exceeded what German estimates had predicted based on their initial dismissive assessment of these vessels. Each Casablanca-class carrier displaced 7,800 tons when fully loaded and measured 512 feet in length, making them substantially smaller than fleet carriers, but far more capable than their improvised origins suggested. The flight deck could safely handle aircraft weighing up to 20,000 pounds landing at speeds approaching 80 miles per hour, thanks to arresting gear systems adapted from fleet carrier designs. The hangar deck, located beneath the flight deck, could accommodate 28 aircraft, along with full maintenance facilities for conducting repairs and routine servicing. Ammunition magazines held 500,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, along with sufficient depth charges, bombs and torpedoes to support 2 weeks of continuous combat operations without requiring replenishment from a supply vessel. Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, one of Germany's most highly decorated U-boat commanders, with multiple successful patrols to his credit, encountered this new reality firsthand on July 13, 1943, when U-201 was caught on the surface by aircraft from USS Kor. His post-action report, filed after he managed to escape destruction, though not detection, revealed the psychological shock of finding himself hunted rather than hunter. Schnee described how aircraft appeared without any warning whatsoever, giving him no time to execute a proper crash dive with the boat buttoned up properly. He went deep immediately anyway, taking his boat down with hatches still being secured, and heard multiple depth charges detonating close enough to shake the hull. The boat remained at maximum depth for 6 hours, the crew sitting in silence while the battery charge slowly depleted and the air grew progressively more foul. When Schnee finally surfaced after dark, believing himself safe under the cover of night, his boat was immediately illuminated by aircraft equipped with powerful searchlights that turned night into day. This terrifying pattern repeated 3 more times over the course of that endless night. Each time Schnee surfaced to recharge batteries, aircraft seemed to know exactly where and when his boat would emerge, arriving almost instantly to force another crash dive. What Schnee couldn't know from his position inside the hunted submarine was that Kor's aircraft carried ASV Mark III radar systems capable of detecting a surfaced submarine at ranges up to 15 miles, even in complete darkness. When this radar detection capability was combined with powerful searchlights for illumination and acoustic homing torpedoes that could track underwater targets, darkness no longer provided any protection whatsoever for surfaced submarines. U-boat crews had always counted on nighttime surface operations as absolutely essential to their operational effectiveness. Surfacing at night allowed them to recharge batteries using diesel generators, make high-speed runs to intercept convoy routes, and conduct periscope attacks under cover of darkness. Now every single surface moment, day or night, invited instant death from aircraft that appeared out of nowhere with devastating accuracy. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Submarine crews went from feeling like apex predators stalking helpless merchant ships to feeling like prey being systematically hunted by an enemy that could see them anywhere, anytime. The production miracle that enabled this transformation defied comprehension for German observers who had been trained to think of shipbuilding as a careful, time-intensive craft. Kaiser Shipbuilding produced its 50th escort carrier, USS Casablanca, in November 1943, representing just 18 months after laying the keel for the very first vessel in the program. The ship itself was constructed in 101 days from initial keel laying to final commissioning, a timeline that would have been considered impossible for any warship just a few years earlier. Every single component was standardized according to detailed specifications that allowed parts to be manufactured at separate facilities and assembled with perfect fit at the shipyard. Components manufactured in 267 different factories scattered across 32 states arrived at the shipyard according to precise schedules that kept the assembly process moving forward 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, without interruption. German intelligence officer Fregattenkapitän Hans Mechel spent considerable time analyzing American shipbuilding capacity during December 1943, compiling a report that Admiral Dönitz initially rejected as defeatist propaganda rather than realistic assessment. Mechel's analysis concluded that American escort carrier production appeared to exceed 1 complete unit weekly at peak production periods. At this rate of construction, he calculated, by mid-1944, the Americans would possess over 100 such vessels scattered across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Each carrier effectively negated the operational effectiveness of 3 to 5 U-boats through the air coverage it provided, meaning that the U-boat force was being systematically neutralized through simple arithmetic. Mechel's projection indicated that the U-boat force would be rendered completely ineffective within 12 months unless something dramatic changed, a conclusion that Dönitz found too depressing to accept initially. By January 1944, American escort carriers had evolved beyond their original mission of simply defending convoys from submarine attack. Now they were actively hunting U-boats in dedicated hunter-killer groups that prowled the Atlantic using intelligence gathered from ultra-intercepts of German communications to locate U-boat patrol lines. The hunted had indeed become the hunters in a reversal of roles that would have seemed impossible just 18 months earlier. German submarines increasingly found themselves trapped in an environment that grew more deadly with each passing week. U-boat ace Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, commanding U-515 and holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves representing 26 ships sunk, experienced this role reversal firsthand on April 9, 1944. Operating north of the Azores in an area that should have been relatively safe from concentrated anti-submarine efforts, U-515 was located by aircraft from USS Guadalcanal that had been vectored to the area based on decrypted communications. Henke, despite all his experience and skill, found himself completely helpless against the coordinated air and surface attack that followed. His final radio message conveyed a level of desperation that would have been unthinkable from a decorated ace just a year earlier. Under attack by multiple aircraft, he transmitted, "Cannot remain surfaced due to air attacks. Cannot escape submerged due to battery depletion. Chlorine gas developing in boat from damaged battery cells. Destroyers closing on position. This is the end." The message captured in a few brief sentences the complete reversal of tactical fortunes that escort carriers had created. The escort carrier Guadalcanal and her dedicated hunter-killer group had revolutionized anti-submarine warfare through their operational flexibility and persistence. Operating independently of convoy protection duties, these groups could pursue individual U-boat contacts for days or even weeks, maintaining pressure until the submarine was either destroyed or forced to surface and surrender. During this particular patrol alone, Guadalcanal's group would sink 3 U-boats and inflict serious damage on 2 others, demonstrating a level of effectiveness that exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections. The carrier's aircraft flew an astounding 2,484 flight hours over the course of 30 days at sea, creating a bubble of air coverage that turned a vast expanse of ocean into a submarine death zone. German submarines that had once prowled these waters like wolves now cowered beneath the waves, emerging only when absolutely necessary, and then only with extreme caution. The technical superiority of American production extended well beyond simple numerical superiority. Each successive class of escort carrier incorporated lessons learned from previous operations, creating a continuous improvement cycle that rapidly enhanced capabilities. The Casablanca-class ships constructed in late 1943 featured significantly improved radar systems, providing better detection ranges, enhanced communication systems, allowing better coordination with escort vessels, stronger flight decks capable of handling heavier aircraft, and improved crew habitability that reduced fatigue during extended operations. German observers, who had expected American mass production to inevitably mean inferior quality, discovered exactly the opposite reality. The Americans were getting better at building these ships, even as they accelerated production rates. Kapitän zur See Klaus Scholz, tasked with analyzing captured American technical documents during February 1944, submitted a report to U-Boat Command that expressed genuine amazement at American manufacturing capabilities. Scholz described how the Americans employed assembly techniques that should have been theoretically impossible to apply to ship construction. Entire sections of the hull, some weighing up to 200 tons, were prefabricated in assembly halls complete with all installed equipment, wiring harnesses, and piping systems. These massive sections were then lifted by enormous cranes and welded together on the slipway, allowing a ship to literally take shape in weeks rather than the months or years required by traditional construction methods. Each vessel benefited from lessons learned during the construction of previous hulls, creating a knowledge accumulation effect that continuously improved quality even as production accelerated. By March 1944, the psychological transformation of the U-boat force had reached its completion. Crews that had once competed intensely for bragging rights about tonnage sunk now celebrated the simple fact of survival through another patrol. Morale had collapsed completely as experienced submariners recognized the mathematical reality of their situation. With over 50 escort carriers operational in the Atlantic theater alone and more launching monthly from American shipyards, there was literally nowhere in the ocean beyond aircraft reach. Every square mile of the Atlantic had become a potential killing zone. The statistical evidence confirmed this transformation with brutal clarity. During May 1943, before escort carriers had become fully operational in significant numbers, U-boats had managed to sink 50 Allied merchant ships, still representing a significant threat to supply lines. By May 1944, with over 60 escort carriers prowling both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, U-boats managed to sink only 5 merchant ships during the entire month, while losing 25 submarines to Allied action. The exchange ratio had reversed so completely that Dönitz seriously considered suspending Atlantic operations entirely and redirecting all available boats to other theaters where escort carrier coverage remained less comprehensive. USS Block Island exemplified the continued evolution of escort carrier tactics and capabilities. Operating with 4 dedicated destroyer escorts as a hunter-killer group, Block Island pioneered nighttime operations using radar-equipped Avengers that could locate and attack submarines in complete darkness. On May 29, 1944, Block Island's aircraft located U-549 running on the surface at night, exactly the scenario that should have provided the submarine with safety. The coordinated attack that followed demonstrated just how precise American anti-submarine operations had become through experience and technological refinement. Aircraft maintained continuous contact while vectoring the destroyer escorts toward the submarine's position with radioed instructions. When U-549 executed a crash dive to escape the aircraft, sonobuoys deployed by the Avengers tracked the submarine's underwater movement, providing the destroyers with continuous targeting data. The submarine fought desperately against overwhelming odds, and in a final act of defiance managed to torpedo Block Island before being hunted down and destroyed by the escort destroyers. Block Island became one of only 6 escort carriers lost to enemy action during the entire war, a remarkably low casualty rate given the thousands of sorties flown and hundreds of engagements fought. The loss of Block Island, rather than representing a German tactical victory, actually illustrated American industrial supremacy in its purest form. Block Island was replaced by 2 brand-new escort carriers within a matter of weeks. Her surviving aircraft and trained aircrews were transferred to other carriers with barely a pause in operational tempo, and her escort destroyers were immediately reassigned to another hunter-killer group. The Americans could absorb losses that would have been devastating to the German war effort and continue operations without missing a beat. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz confronted this harsh reality during a staff conference held on June 2, 1944. The transcript of this meeting, recovered after the war, reveals his complete understanding of how thoroughly the tactical situation had shifted against German submarine operations. Dönitz stated plainly that the enemy's small carriers had systematically eliminated every tactical advantage that U-boats had previously exploited. German submarines could no longer operate on the surface during daylight hours due to aircraft patrols. They could not operate on the surface at night due to radar-equipped aircraft with searchlights. The Americans had not defeated German submarines through superior tactics or better seamanship, Dönitz acknowledged. They had made the ocean uninhabitable through overwhelming industrial production. It was a grudging admission that Germany had lost the production war before the shooting war had even properly begun. Oberleutnant zur See Ernst Hachagen, assigned to analyze American production capabilities during September 1944, compiled statistics that revealed the full magnitude of the challenge Germany faced. Each escort carrier required 30,000 tons of steel, 2,000 miles of electrical cable, 50 miles of various piping, 80,000 separate blueprints, and 45,000 different components ranging from massive turbine assemblies to tiny electrical switches. Yet the Americans were producing them with the same systematic efficiency they applied to manufacturing automobiles. The Seattle-Tacoma shipbuilding facility alone had delivered 16 completed carriers in 18 months, a production rate that seemed to mock German attempts to maintain submarine construction levels. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding USS Guadalcanal, achieved what became the ultimate demonstration of escort carrier dominance on June 4, 1944. His hunter-killer group forced U-505 to the surface through relentless depth charge attacks and then captured the submarine intact, marking the first time the United States Navy had captured an enemy warship at sea since 1815. The submarine's seizure, complete with code books and encryption equipment, demonstrated beyond any doubt that U-boats had been reduced from predators to prey. The captured submarine was towed back to the United States, where it eventually became a museum exhibit, a trophy celebrating American industrial might and tactical innovation. The statistical transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic told a story of complete reversal. During 1942, before escort carriers became operational in meaningful numbers, U-boats had sunk 1,160 Allied ships, representing more than 6 million tons of shipping. By 1944, with escort carriers dominating every major convoy route and hunting in dedicated killer groups, U-boats managed to sink only 132 ships totaling 773,000 tons, while losing 249 submarines to Allied action. The mathematics had shifted from unsustainable Allied losses to unsustainable German losses, and everyone involved understood what this meant for the eventual outcome. German recognition of this fundamental shift appeared in unexpected contexts and conversations. Lieutenant zur See Hans Rudolf Rösing, captured from U-846 during May 1944 and interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, provided remarkably candid assessment of German morale and strategic understanding. The interrogators asked him when he had realized Germany would lose the war. Rosing answered without hesitation that the turning point had been when U-boat crews started counting American escort carriers. During 1943, he explained, German submariners had laughed at these converted merchant ships, dismissing them as desperate improvisations. By 1944, these same submariners feared escort carriers more than battleships or heavy cruisers because a single escort carrier could effectively clear an entire ocean area of submarines. Total American escort carrier production reached 151 ships by the time the war ended, with 122 built in United States shipyards and 29 constructed in British facilities using American designs and technical assistance. These ships collectively operated approximately 4,000 aircraft at peak strength, representing more airframes than the entire German Luftwaffe possessed during 1944. The pilots flying these aircraft, trained in programs that produced 35,000 naval aviators annually at peak output, outnumbered the total complement of German U-boat crews by a factor of 3. The disparity in resources had become so overwhelming that individual German skill and courage could no longer compensate. Vice Admiral Lionel Wells, assigned to analyze escort carrier effectiveness for the Navy Department after the war concluded, summarized the program's success in terms that captured its revolutionary nature. The escort carrier program, Wells wrote, represented the perfect convergence of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and strategic necessity, arriving at precisely the right moment. The Americans had built merchant ships capable of launching aircraft, trained civilians to fly them competently in abbreviated programs, and fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare in the process. The program succeeded not despite its improvised nature, but because of it, proving that American pragmatism could trump European tradition. The human dimension of this transformation was perhaps best captured in interrogation transcripts of Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Haider captured from U-575 during March 1944. When asked what had destroyed the effectiveness of the U-boat force, Haider answered with remarkable insight. The escort carriers killed the U-boat force through presence rather than direct combat, he explained. These vessels were everywhere, always. U-boat crews spent entire patrols submerged without ever sighting a target, seeing nothing but the endless grey-green underwater world visible through periscopes. Men went mad from the psychological stress of being hunted continuously. Those little carriers that America built in weeks had destroyed the elite of German naval power more thoroughly than any battleship ever could. Admiral Royal Ingersoll, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, provided congressional testimony during March 1945 that assessed the escort carrier program from a strategic perspective. Ingersoll stated that the program had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic expectations held at its inception. The original intention had been simply to provide convoys with some measure of air protection in areas beyond land-based aircraft range. Instead, these carriers had eliminated the submarine threat so completely that by early 1945, convoys were crossing the Atlantic with minimal losses despite Germany still possessing operational U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won not by destroyers conducting depth charge attacks or long-range patrol aircraft flying from land bases, but by these converted merchant ships that traditionalists had initially dismissed as floating coffins. The German Navy's final assessment came from Gross Admiral Dönitz himself, speaking to assembled U-boat commanders in his farewell address delivered on May 4, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. Dönitz acknowledged that his submariners had fought with extraordinary gallantry against overwhelming odds that no amount of individual courage could overcome. The enemy's production of aircraft carriers, he stated plainly, had rendered their struggle hopeless from a strategic perspective. The Americans had built carriers faster than Germany could construct submarines, trained pilots faster than Germany could train qualified crews, and systematically covered the ocean with aircraft until there was nowhere left to hide. It was a remarkably honest assessment from a commander addressing men who had suffered catastrophic casualties in a campaign that had been lost not through any failure of courage, but through simple arithmetic. Post-war analysis conducted by both Allied and German researchers revealed the full scope of what the escort carrier program had accomplished. These ships flew over 460,000 combat sorties during the course of the war across all theatres. Their aircraft either sank directly or participated in attacks that sank 53 German U-boats and 17 Japanese submarines, though this number undercounts their true impact. The air coverage they provided forced countless submarines to remain submerged and therefore ineffective, preventing attacks that never appeared in casualty statistics. They provided essential air cover for every major amphibious operation conducted after 1943, from North Africa through Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific Island campaigns. Only 6 American escort carriers were lost to enemy action out of more than 100 that saw combat, a survivability rate that vindicated their design despite initial concerns about vulnerability. The Kaiser shipyards that produced the majority of escort carriers became enduring symbols of American manufacturing power and innovation. Workers who had never built ships before the war began found themselves launching carriers at rates that peacetime professional shipbuilders considered physically impossible. Women comprised 27% of the workforce at peak employment, shattering pre-war assumptions about gender roles in heavy industry. African Americans made up another 15% of workers, finding opportunities in defense industries that had previously excluded them. This remarkably diverse workforce produced carriers that swept German submarines from the Atlantic and Japanese forces from Pacific sea lanes with equal effectiveness. Captain Eric Brown, a legendary British test pilot who flew from numerous American escort carriers during the war, provided perspective that captured the revolutionary nature of these vessels. The Germans mocked these ships initially because they fundamentally didn't understand the revolution these carriers represented in naval warfare, Brown explained in post-war interviews. One escort carrier operating alone was indeed vulnerable to concentrated attack and relatively limited in capability. But 50 escort carriers distributed across the Atlantic created an impenetrable web of air coverage that made submarine operations suicidal. The Americans grasped this essential truth about coverage and persistence. The Germans never understood it until far too late to matter. Fregattenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, widely regarded as Germany's most successful U-boat ace before his capture during 1941, watched the entire transformation unfold from various prisoner of war camps in Canada and Britain. Released after the war concluded, he wrote extensively about what he called the fundamental failure of German strategic thinking. According to Kretschmer, German planners failed completely to understand that Americans approached warfare as fundamentally an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. While Germany focused obsessively on tactical refinement and crew quality, America focused on production volume and systematic coverage of operational areas. The escort carriers were not individually better ships than German U-boats when compared one-to-one, Kretschmer acknowledged. They were simply the right ships produced in the right numbers to solve the specific problem of convoy protection. German U-boat veteran Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had commanded the famous U-96 that inspired both a book and film, reflected on these lessons during a 1975 interview. The escort carriers taught an entire generation of German naval officers a harsh lesson in humility, he stated. Germans had believed that war was fundamentally about warrior skill, superior tactics developed through professional military education, and the courage to execute those tactics under fire. The Americans demonstrated conclusively that modern industrial warfare was actually about production capacity and the ability to achieve systematic coverage of vast areas. Those little carriers that German admirals initially mocked represented something Germany never truly understood throughout the entire war, which was the American ability to transform absolutely any problem into a production solution that could be solved through overwhelming material superiority. Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, who commanded multiple escort carrier task groups during both Atlantic and Pacific operations, offered his own summary of what had been achieved. The Americans took basic merchant hulls, added flight decks using techniques adapted from commercial construction, and changed naval history forever in the process. The Germans laughed initially because all they could see were converted merchantmen that violated every principle of proper naval architecture. Americans saw mobile airfields that could be positioned anywhere in the ocean at any time to provide coverage wherever needed. Germans counted individual ships and assessed individual capabilities. Americans counted total coverage area and calculated how many ships were needed to blanket the ocean. The difference in perspective was what ultimately determined the outcome. The final irony of the entire escort carrier story came from the very top of German leadership. In April 1945, as the Reich collapsed around him, the Führer reportedly asked Dönitz during a meeting why the U-boats were failing so comprehensively when they had once dominated the Atlantic. Dönitz explained about the escort carriers and the systematic air coverage they provided. The leader allegedly responded by asking why Germany had not built similar vessels. Dönitz replied simply that Germany could not build one carrier per week as the Americans were doing. The Führer, confronted with this arithmetic reality, reportedly had no response whatsoever, falling silent in the face of production statistics that told a story of complete industrial overmatching. By May 8, 1945, when Germany finally surrendered unconditionally, the United States Navy operated 105 escort carriers with additional vessels still under construction in shipyards that hadn't yet received cancellation orders. These ships had systematically transformed the Atlantic Ocean from a contested battle space into what was effectively an Allied lake. The U-boat force that had nearly succeeded in starving Britain during the darkest days of the war had itself been starved of operational space until submarines had nowhere left to operate with any reasonable chance of survival. Many late-war U-boats never fired a single torpedo in anger during their entire operational careers, spending patrol after patrol simply hiding from carrier aircraft that seemed to blanket every square mile of ocean. Statistical analysis conducted after the war confirmed the completeness of this transformation. During 1942, a U-boat departing on patrol had approximately a 75% chance of returning safely to port, making submarine duty dangerous but survivable. By early 1945, that survival rate had plummeted to roughly 25%, meaning 3 out of every 4 boats that departed never returned. The primary cause of this catastrophic increase in losses was aircraft, predominantly operating from escort carriers. Of the 40,000 German sailors who served in U-boats during the war, approximately 30,000 died, representing a casualty rate of 75% that exceeded even the losses suffered by bomber crews. Most of these deaths occurred after escort carriers made submarine operations essentially suicidal, meaning these men were sacrificed to a strategic misconception that American industrial capacity couldn't overcome German tactical expertise and warrior tradition. Commander George Chamberlain, who served aboard USS Guadalcanal during multiple combat patrols, offered perspective that captured the asymmetry of the contest. American sailors weren't inherently better than their German counterparts when compared on individual basis, Chamberlain acknowledged in post-war interviews. German U-boat crews were incredibly brave, highly skilled, and dedicated to their mission with a professionalism that commanded respect. But Americans had endless carriers operating endless aircraft from an industrial base that Germany simply couldn't match. Every submarine Germany managed to build and man, America countered with a carrier that could hunt it across thousands of square miles of ocean. It wasn't a fair fight, Chamberlain concluded, but then again, it wasn't supposed to be fair. The escort carrier program cost approximately $1.5 billion in 1940s currency, a massive investment that nonetheless proved extraordinarily cost-effective when measured against results achieved. This investment systematically destroyed the U-boat force as an effective weapon while simultaneously saving countless Allied merchant ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Each escort carrier cost roughly $7 million to construct and could protect convoys carrying cargo worth exponentially more while simultaneously destroying submarines worth millions more in construction costs and irreplaceable trained crews. Workers at Kaiser shipyards and other facilities involved in escort carrier construction expressed genuine pride in what they had accomplished. Rosie Devlin, a welder who worked on 12 different escort carriers during her time at the Vancouver yard, spoke for many when she said that everyone understood these ships weren't elegant or beautiful in the traditional sense. They were basic, simple, and obviously improvised from merchant ship components. But everyone also knew these carriers worked exactly as intended, protecting convoys and hunting submarines with devastating effectiveness. Every carrier the workforce launched meant that convoys would arrive safely in Britain, keeping supply lines open and sustaining the war effort. In this sense, the workers building carriers were fighting the war just as surely as combat crews, using rivet guns and welding torches as their weapons against fascism. The final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic tells a stark story of industrial warfare carried to its logical conclusion. Germany began the war with 57 operational U-boats and constructed 1,162 additional submarines during the course of the conflict. They lost 785 U-boats total, with 632 lost directly to Allied action. Approximately 175 were destroyed by escort carrier aircraft or hunter-killer groups centered on these vessels. Considering that escort carriers only became fully operational in mid-1943, representing roughly 2 years of the 6-year war, this casualty figure demonstrates extraordinary effectiveness concentrated in a relatively brief period. Starting from 0 escort carriers in 1941, the United States built 151 by 1945, a construction program that fundamentally altered naval warfare while maintaining operational availability rates exceeding 80%. These ships operated approximately 4,500 aircraft at peak strength, flew over 460,000 sorties across all theatres, and changed the fundamental calculus of submarine warfare in ways that persist to the present day. U-boat commander Herbert Werner, one of the very few to survive the entire war conducting multiple combat patrols, provided what might be considered the definitive summary from the German perspective. The escort carriers killed the U-boat force through superior presence that could not be evaded, Werner wrote in his post-war memoir. Individual ships could be avoided through skill and luck. Systematic coverage extending across entire ocean basins could not. Every carrier the Americans launched effectively shrunk German operational areas a bit more, until finally submarines had nowhere left to go except down to the bottom. The transformation from German contempt to complete despair occurred in less than 18 months, a timeline that demonstrated industrial warfare operated on fundamentally different timescales than traditional military planning anticipated. This rapid reversal showed conclusively that while Germany slowly refined submarine technology seeking marginal improvements, America simply multiplied carrier production geometrically. The German response, preserved in captured Kriegsmarine archives recovered after the war, eventually settled into resigned acceptance. The American escort carrier program succeeded through what German analysts characterized as brute industrial force applied systematically. Americans built carriers faster than Germany could sink them, trained pilots faster than Germany could shoot them down, and covered the ocean with aircraft faster than U-boats could find safe operating areas. Germany had been defeated not by superior warriors, but by superior factories, a conclusion that traditional military culture found difficult to accept. The escort carriers that German admirals laughed at dismissively during 1943 had by 1945 transformed the Atlantic from a U-boat hunting ground into an Allied-controlled waterway where submarines operated only at extreme risk. These converted merchant ships accomplished what the Royal Navy's destroyers could not achieve through the war's first years, which was the complete suppression of the submarine threat through overwhelming presence and systematic coverage. German admirals who survived to see the war's end stood silently aboard these same vessels they had once mocked, watching U-boats surface to surrender, understanding finally that these simple ships had destroyed the U-boat force more completely than any enemy in maritime history. The transformation took less than 2 years from conception to complete dominance. In that remarkably brief period, American industrial capacity systematically rewrote naval warfare rules that had existed for centuries and seemed immutable. The story concludes where it began, with German naval officers examining American escort carriers. But instead of laughing at their crude construction and improvised nature, these officers stood in defeated silence, understanding at last that these vessels built in weeks had systematically destroyed the U-boat force that represented decades of German naval tradition and expertise. American industrial might had transformed maritime warfare forever, proving that production capacity could trump tactical sophistication when applied with sufficient scale and determination. The final testimony came from Gross Admiral Dönitz himself, speaking to his staff as Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost not to superior seamanship or tactical brilliance, he acknowledged with the honesty that defeat sometimes forces. Germany lost to superior arithmetic applied relentlessly. The Americans built escort carriers faster than German planners could comprehend the implications. Germans thought war was fundamentally about warriors and warrior culture. Americans understood it was about production capacity and systematic application of resources. Germans were wrong in this assessment. Americans were correct. That simple fact, more than any tactical consideration, explains the outcome.